Hi, I'm Tanya Opperman. I work for the Wildland Fire Management Research Development and Applications Group. I also work as a long-term analyst on wildfires. I'm going to present a way to assess fire risks and benefits at the incident level. Managing wildfires well requires decision makers to use the best available information to assess risk trade-offs, but we often focus solely on firefighter and public safety in our risk analysis. In this presentation, I used the Montana-Idaho 2015 Clark Fork Complex to illustrate a method that my colleagues and I used with local fire and resource personnel and the incident management team to successfully develop and implement a wildfire risk assessment for values other than safety in real time. Most of what we call risk management in wildland fire is focused on firefighter and public safety. Indeed, this is the highest priority. This form, referred to as the 215A or the 215R, is the safety risk analysis. It identifies hazards, likelihood, and severity for actions taken on the fire, and then the level of risk expected for the next day and a plan to address it, and then the changed risk level as a result of the mitigation. Although this process addresses firefighter and public safety, there are at least 30 other identified highly valued resources and assets on this fire identified by the agency administrators. I'm focusing on a process that can be done at the local level at the time of the incident, whether or not the unit has a sophisticated wildfire risk assessment already in place. Once a particular fire is ignited on a specific landscape under a known weather condition or seasonal severity, assessing potential resource benefits requires a different focus and some different tools. It also tends to get all sorts of people interested in fire effects. It also uses the wildfire risk assessment triangle: intensity, susceptibility, and likelihood, which was published by Scott and others in 2013. Here's the list of highly valued resources and assets, or HVRAs, that were identified by the host units. It's important to emphasize the need for leadership to be engaged. Decision makers must be clear about their expectations when communicating with an incident management team. Otherwise, firefighter exposure, fire benefits, resource damage, all are often less than desirable. There is no doubt there are times when aggressive fire suppression is necessary, but a process can be used to assess when it is or isn't needed. The leader's intent on this fire was clear. There was an expectation to use a risk assessment to justify suppression actions and firefighter exposure. The incident management team could just take this list and keep fire away and treat fire as a 1-0 or a binary option. But instead, the list was used as a tool to discuss both the effects of fire and the need for suppression, coming back to this concept of wildfire risk assessment. There are basically 6 steps to this process, which will remain on the bottom of the screen as we walk through them, and it required the following personnel: an engaged agency administrator, shown as AA at the top, as we just talked about, and a dedicated resource advisor, which was requested by the IC and provided to the AA to work with fire behavior and planning on the IMT. And then an LTAN, which is a long-term analyst, and a SOPAL, which is the strategic operational planner. Both were provided by the IMT to communicate results to operations. And then operations folks were willing to use the risk assessment in planning and decision making, and the IC was needed to guide and support the risk assessment process in order to meet the needs of the agency administrator. Our first task was to refine the original list. As we went through the process, the list got larger. This was expected because we started planning further and further out from the immediate fire edge. We implemented some sideboards by deciding to work only in the area that was defined by the 7-day FS Pro run. The decision maker verified that the items on the list were appropriate to driving strategies and tactics. She had the authority to add or remove items from the list. Since there were 2 forests, we needed a combined, prioritized list. The lead read facilitated this by organizing resource specialists and stakeholders from each forest. We also needed this product turned around quickly, not days, but in hours. In the end, the prioritized list was approved by the IC, the lead read, and the agency administrator. Once we had the list, we had to look at fire effects for each item on that list. We talked with the reads about the different fire types we could actually model in our fire behavior programs, which are surface, passive, and active crown fire behavior. So we used illustrations like these to facilitate those conversations with the reads. We basically went through the HVRA list and the reads assessed how each type of flame length or fire type would affect the resource. So for surface fire, that was described as low flame lengths, generally limited to surface fuels, not burning the crowns of trees, and in terms of severity, tree mortality would be low but might differ by age and species, and preferentially kill young trees or less resistant species over a limited area. For passive crown fire, we talked about that primarily being in surface fuels, but with occasional torching of individual trees or small groups of trees, and then producing a patchy burn with mixed severity and a greater mortality of fire-sensitive species. And for active crown fire, we talked about how the majority of tree crowns in the overstory would see fire, and this would occur under extreme fire weather conditions, highly resistant to control, and often be beyond the capability of any suppression effort. These fires would result in high mortality of most tree species. Each resource had an overall priority seen here in column 2, and then notes to describe how that resource was susceptible to fire, seen in column 3, and each was assigned either acceptable or undesirable for each fire type. We realize this was not perfect. It's a good starting point when there's no pre-planned risk assessment and decisions need to be made. For example, a low severity fire could negatively impact the cedar grove, a very highly valued asset. In some cases, the agency administrator changed the acceptable to undesirable, where political consequences could not be tolerated. This occurred for the Ross Ancient Cedar Grove. Although the Reeds thought it could withstand passive fire, the agency administrator was only willing to go with surface fire due to social and political concerns. This spreadsheet addresses the susceptibility and 3 levels of severity/intensity. We called it the susceptibility severity spreadsheet. We ran the WFDS short-term fire behavior model to get a landscape output of the 3 fire types. Those are surface, passive, and active crown fire. And this was the expected fire behavior for the next day using predictions for the most intense portion of the burn period. And you can see in the legend that most of the expected fire behavior here was surface, with very little passive fire behavior and no crown fire behavior. We used the modeled fire behavior and added a column to our spreadsheet to show the potential fire outcome for the next day. We also added a column for the FS Pro output, showing the likelihood that a resource would be impacted in the next 7 days. The colored boxes correspond to the FS Pro probability output, and the text in the box is the management action point that triggers a response for the resource. We printed a 8.5 by 11 copy of this for operations every day at 1500 hours so that they could use it to prepare for their pre-strategy meeting and also be familiar with these items prior to the planning meeting with all the cooperators, etc. later in the day. As you can imagine, this entire spreadsheet was hard to display at the daily planning meetings, but the agency administrator expected us to show how the incident management team was considering the fire response and firefighter exposure based on impacts to values. We highlighted the portions of the table that were relevant to tomorrow's operations and printed those in a large format. Above the gray line were things already being addressed by operations, and below the gray line were items that were not being addressed in the current planning cycle, with the highest probabilities at the top. If there was a value that had not been addressed by operations, there could be a dialogue about the need. You can see here that actions to protect Star Peak Lookout needed to be assessed if Management Action Point 8 was breached, and that MAP had a greater than 80% chance of being breached in the next 7 days. Here's the lookout at the X, and the brown line is Management Action Point 8, which triggered the action, and the red polygon is the fire edge. Only crown fire was considered problematic, and the predictions for the next operational period and beyond were for surface fire. Therefore, no actions were taken. And deciding on a no action meant that firefighters could be used elsewhere, and a helicopter did not need to be dedicated. It was important to keep the susceptibility and severity spreadsheet updated and incorporated into the daily planning cycle. This is where decisions are made every single day about how to tactically respond to the fire with handline, dozers, aerial resources, monitoring, etc., and where to deploy firefighting personnel. Knowing the values, their importance, the probability of impacts, the type of impacts, and mitigations was essential to proper risk management. Because the product is currently a spreadsheet, it's difficult to archive in WFDIS. We chose to upload a picture file of the spreadsheet as an example in the Reports tab, along with instructions for future analysts and SOPLs, but our documentation was mostly kept on our computers. Keep it simple. More detail is not better for the planning meeting. You need to focus on what matters in the next 1 to 3 days and not the whole list, because it tends to get people lost in those details. The process requires an LTAN and SOPL to organize the work, a dedicated read who knows the local resource, a willing ops section chief to use the results and give feedback, and a planning section chief who will allow the discussion to be worked into the planning meeting. The prioritized list of values must be nailed down early in the process. Giving ops a list of prioritized values 5 days into an incident can make it difficult to change direction. And finally, the social and political realities do need verification through the agency administrator. In conclusion, when there are 30 highly valued resources and assets, we can't continue to just use the risk assessment for the highest priority of firefighter and public safety and treat the other 29 as if fire were a binary good-bad option. I've demonstrated a relatively easy process that can be used on incidents with tools we already have and no additional expertise. And by using this risk assessment process to address all the other natural and cultural HVRAs, we have more opportunities to use fire for resource benefits and potentially reduce suppression damage, costs, and firefighter exposure. Having this table right out in front of everyone at the planning meeting helped assure the agency administrator and the cooperators that the right things were being done or not done for the right reasons. And finally, there is now a benefits tab in WFDIS, and the next steps will be exploring how this type of incident-specific information could be included in strategic decision-making using WFDIS. I'd like to thank the people who contributed to making this process happen. It was certainly a group effort, and you can find a sample spreadsheet to use in your own incident risk assessment on our website, which is listed here at the top of the slide. Thanks for listening.